In a forgotten mountain town, a single act of courage changed everything. A wounded officer, a loyal German shepherd, and a secret buried beneath the snow. What they found would test the limits of love, faith, and sacrifice. Some say it was fate, others call it a miracle. But one thing is certain, the truth was never meant to stay hidden. Before we begin this journey of hope and redemption, tell me, where are you watching from today? Leave your city in the comments below. And wherever you are, may your heart stay warm, your faith stay strong, and may you have a truly beautiful day ahead. The town of Silver Ridge, Oregon, slept beneath a curtain of rain. The morning sky was a smear of gray and pearl, the kind that turned the pine trees into ghostly silhouettes and made the asphalt gleam like black glass. The sound of the storm came steady and sure, drumming against the roofs, sliding down the gutters, wrapping the valley in a lonely rhythm. It was a quiet place, a small town that had once been proud of its lumber mills and honest hands, now half forgotten by the highways that curved around it. Inside the Silver Ridge Police Department, Officer Evan Mercer sat at his desk, a half-empty cup of black coffee cooling beside a stack of uneventful reports. Evan was 36, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the deliberate stillness of someone who had once lived through chaos. His hair, dark brown with faint silver at the temples, was trimmed short in the military way he never abandoned. A thin scar ran along the inside of his left wrist, a souvenir from his time as a Marine in Afghanistan, when a roadside blast had buried his unit in sand and smoke. Since then, he had moved like a man careful not to wake ghosts. His voice was calm, his eyes a storm gray that revealed little. He had joined the Silver Ridge Force 5 years ago, drawn by the promise of quiet work and a place where no one screamed in the night. The townspeople respected him. Some pitied him, whispering about the fiancé who had died while he was overseas. But Evan rarely looked back. His days were steady, predictable, until that morning. The clock above the bulletin board read 8:43 when the station door burst open. Wind and rain followed a small figure inside, a little girl no older than 8, barefoot, her thin red cotton dress clinging to her legs. Mud streaked her knees, and her light brown hair hung in tangled strands across her face. Her eyes were wild, blue as shattered glass, filled with terror and desperation. "Please!" she cried, her voice hoarse. "Please! They're hurting my dog!" Evan was on his feet before the papers on his desk had finished falling. Hey, slow down," he said, moving toward her, lowering his voice to a steady, careful calm. "You're safe here. What's your name?" The girl's chest heaved as she spoke between sobs. Clara Hensley. Please, you have to help him. They're going to kill him. My dog, Shadow." From the back of the room, an older officer looked up from his paperwork. Deputy Hank Miller, in his late 50s, was built like an oak tree gone to seed, broad, stooped, with gray whiskers framing a face carved from long years of small-town trouble. Hank had served this town since before Evan was born. He knew every fence post and rumor. His eyes narrowed when he heard the name. "Hensley?" Hank muttered, setting down his mug. "You mean Irene Hensley's kin, the family up by Timber Hill?" Clara nodded frantically, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "My grandma, she can't walk fast. They told her to leave, but she couldn't, and Shadow tried to protect her. They're hitting him, with chains." Evan's gut tightened. "Who's they, Clara?" "3 men," she said, trembling. "They came in a black truck with no plate. One of them said they were taking the land because it's not ours anymore." Hank exhaled sharply, muttering something under his breath. "Sounds like Doran's boys again." Evan turned to him. "Doran?" Hank nodded grimly. "Vincent Doran, big developer from Portland. Owns half the property north of here. He's been leaning on folks to sell for that new resort project. The Hensleys never signed. I heard Irene swore she'd die on that hill before letting them build." Evan grabbed his jacket from the rack. "You think he's behind this?" "I think," Hank said, rubbing his jaw. "You're about to find out. But you be careful, Mercer. Doran's got money, and money makes men feel bulletproof." Evan crouched beside the little girl, meeting her eyes. "We'll get your dog, Clara, I promise." Outside, the rain hit him like a wall, cold, relentless, and alive. He opened the passenger door of his patrol SUV and helped Clara climb in, wrapping his spare jacket around her shoulders. She was shivering, clutching something small in her hands, a frayed blue ribbon, the kind children tie around a beloved pet's neck. "He's all I have left," she whispered as he started the engine. Evan's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. "Then, let's make sure you don't lose him too." They sped through the winding road out of town, wipers thrashing against the downpour. The narrow asphalt twisted between dense pine woods, the kind that swallowed light even on good days. Mist rose from the ground like ghostly breath, and every shadow seemed to move. Evan glanced at the girl beside him. Her face was pale in the glow of the dashboard, lips trembling, eyes fixed on the road ahead. She had the look of someone who'd seen too much too young. "You live with your grandmother?" he asked. She nodded. After Mom and Dad died. They said it was an accident, but Grandma said it wasn't. She said bad men wanted our land." Her voice faltered. "They killed my parents. Now they want Shadow." Evan didn't reply, but in his chest something heavy stirred, the instinct he thought he'd buried when he left the Marines. The cruiser climbed the narrow trail up Timber Hill, the trees crowding close on both sides. When the road bent, the Hensley property appeared, an old wooden farmhouse leaning against time, its paint long peeled away, its roof sagging under the weight of years. A small barn stood half-collapsed behind it, and in the open yard, 3 figures moved in the rain. They were men in dark jackets, built like the kind who carried trouble in their shoulders. One was bald with a jagged scar down his cheek, another tall and lanky with greasy blonde hair tucked under a cap, the third younger, barely 20, his movements uncertain. Evan's eyes locked on the dog. Shadow lay on the muddy ground, fur matted with rain and blood, ribs heaving, but his gaze still fierce. He was a German shepherd, maybe 5 years old, large, strong, with storm-gray fur and a black saddle marking his back. His ears stood high despite exhaustion, and when he saw Clara's silhouette through the windshield, his tail moved once, weak but alive. "Stay in the car," Evan said firmly, voice low but sharp. "Lock the doors." Before Clara could answer, he was already out in the rain, boots splashing through the mud. "Police!" His voice cracked like thunder. "Step away from the animal." The men froze. The bald one turned, sneering through the downpour. "Ain't your business, officer. This property's condemned. We're just clearing it." Evan stopped 10 feet away, his stance solid, one hand resting near his holster. "That land still belongs to the Hensley family, and what you're doing is felony cruelty under Oregon state law. Drop the chain." Lightning flashed, lighting their faces in ghostly white. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a low curse, the scarred man tossed the chain aside and jerked his chin toward the truck. They bolted, splashing through the mud toward a black pickup parked at the edge of the property. The engine roared to life, tires spitting gravel as they sped off into the rain. Evan memorized the dent on the tailgate, the faded sticker on the window. "Doran Development Co." He muttered, "Got you." Then he turned to the dog. Shadow struggled to lift his head, but collapsed with a low whine. Evan knelt beside him, rain streaming down his face, checking the wounds, deep gashes, torn ear, but the pulse was steady. "He's alive," he said softly. Clara ran from the car despite his order, falling to her knees beside the dog. "Shadow, please wake up. You're okay, boy. You're okay." Her voice trembled, breaking into sobs as she stroked his soaked fur. Evan lifted the dog carefully, muscles straining under the weight. "Let's get him inside." The house smelled of cedar and smoke and old memories. In the dim light of the fireplace, an elderly woman sat in a wooden wheelchair, her hands trembling around a framed photograph. Her silver hair was coiled neatly into a bun, her eyes sharp despite the cloud of age. "Grandma!" Clara cried, rushing to her. The woman's face softened. "Clara, thank God. I heard shouting. Are you hurt?" "No, Grandma. Officer Mercer saved us. And Shadow." Evan set the dog gently on a quilt near the hearth. "He'll need a vet, but he's a fighter," he said. "You must be Mrs. Hensley." She nodded slowly. "Irene Hensley. You're the policeman from town?" "Yes, ma'am. You're safe now, but those men may come back. Do you know who sent them?" Irene's gaze drifted toward the rain-lashed window. "A man named Vincent Doran. Said he owns everything from here to the river. My daughter refused to sell. She said this land was her father's blood and sweat. They died not long after. Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. My Emily told me she felt someone following her before the crash. She said, "If anything happens, it won't be by chance." Evan looked toward the mantel, 2 funeral cards beside a single flickering candle. The air felt thick, heavy with the kind of truth people were too afraid to say aloud. "I'll have someone watch the property tonight," he said. Mrs. Hensley's expression hardened. "They can take my legs, officer, but not my land, not my family." In the corner, Clara dabbed Shadow's wounds with a towel. The dog's tail thumped faintly. "He saved me once," she whispered. "When the car went off the road, he pulled me out the window. I think he remembers." Evan stared at her, the rain still drumming against the roof. Coincidence didn't live long in towns like this. "Rest tonight," he said finally, standing. "I'll be back with help. You have my word." As he stepped outside, the rain had softened to a whisper. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. The black truck was gone, but its tracks still cut through the mud like scars across the earth. Evan looked once more at the dim light glowing behind the window, the silhouette of a little girl, her grandmother, and a wounded dog. Something deep in his chest tightened, the way it used to before battle. He knew this wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was the beginning of something much darker buried in the soil of Silver Ridge. He pulled his collar up against the cold and muttered, "You picked the wrong town." Then he walked into the rain. The rain lingered over Silver Ridge like an uninvited guest, tapping at windows and whispering along the gutters. Morning came slow, pale light bleeding through the clouds as though the sun was reluctant to rise. Evan Mercer had spent most of the night in restless thought. His boots were still damp, his hands smelled faintly of mud and smoke, and the echo of Clara's sobs haunted the edges of his mind. There were questions growing roots inside him, about Doran, about the so-called accident, about how deep the rot ran in this quiet town. He stood outside the Hensley farmhouse again, at dawn. The old house looked even frailer in daylight, its porch sagging under years of neglect. From the chimney rose a thin column of smoke, proof that someone inside still fought to keep warmth in their bones. He knocked once before stepping in. Inside, the living room smelled of cedar and damp wool. The fire burned low, painting everything in tones of gold and ember. Clara was kneeling beside the hearth, feeding small twigs into the flames. Her hair was brushed now, tied back with that same frayed blue ribbon. Her eyes were puffy from crying, but there was a quiet determination in them, the kind of resolve children shouldn't need. On the couch lay Shadow, wrapped in an old quilt. His breathing had steadied, though his flank still bore a patch of dried blood. When he saw Evan, his ears flicked up slightly, tail thumping once against the floorboards, a soldier's greeting to another. "Morning," Evan said softly. Clara looked up. "He wagged his tail when he smelled you coming." "That's so?" Evan crouched beside the dog, checking the bandages. "He's a tough one." "He's always been tough," Clara replied. "Dad said Shadow wasn't just a dog. He said he was born to guard the people he loved." Evan smiled faintly. "Your dad sounds like a smart man." From the rocking chair by the window, Irene Hensley stirred. "He was," she said, her voice rasping with age but steady as ever. "And stubborn as a mule, just like his daughter." Evan straightened. "How's the pain in your leg, ma'am?" "I've seen worse." Her eyes, sharp and gray, drifted toward the rain outside. "But I can't stay here much longer. They'll come again, Officer Mercer. You know it." Evan didn't answer right away. He knew she was right. Doran's men had retreated last night, but cowards with money always found new ways to strike. "I'll station someone nearby," he finally said, "and I'll talk to the sheriff about getting you protection." That name hung heavy in the room. Sheriff Cole. Even saying it tasted bitter. Irene's mouth tightened. Cole won't help. Doran bought him years ago. Evan's jaw flexed. He had suspected it, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a verdict. From the kitchen came the faint clink of dishes. Clara emerged moments later, carrying a steaming mug. "I made coffee," she said proudly, handing it to him. "Grandma says you can't fix a storm without starting the morning right." He accepted it with a small nod, the warmth bleeding into his cold hands. You make a good cup. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. I used to make it for Dad when he was working outside. Shadow always sat by his feet, watching. She glanced at the dog, and her eyes softened. I thought he'd never wake up last night. He's strong, Evan said. He's got a reason to be. Outside, the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the fragile calm. Evan's instincts sharpened instantly. His hand brushed the grip of his holster. But when the door opened, it wasn't a threat that entered. It was a woman holding a camera, her coat soaked from the rain, auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail that was coming undone. "Sorry to barge in," she said, brushing water from her sleeves. "I knocked, but the rain's louder than my manners." Evan frowned slightly, recognizing her. "You're Grace Whitmore, right? From the Ridge County Chronicle?" "Guilty," she said with a small grin. Grace was in her late 20s, average height, slim, with a kind of restless energy that filled the room. Her eyes were green, curious, and constantly moving, like someone always chasing the next truth. There was a small scar just beneath her left eyebrow, a faint white line she never tried to hide. It had come, she once told readers, from learning that truth rarely stays quiet. "I was in town last night when the calls came in," she said, lowering her camera bag onto a chair. "They said there was a police standoff up at Timber Hill. I didn't expect to find a child and a wounded dog in the middle of it." Clara looked up from the floor, clutching the edge of the quilt. "You're not here to take us away, are you?" Grace's face softened. "No, sweetheart. I'm here to make sure no one does." Evan shot her a look. "This isn't a story for the morning paper." Grace crossed her arms. "No, it's a story for justice. And from the way you're glaring, I'm guessing you already know that." Irene chuckled softly. "She's got a point, officer." Evan sighed. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Neither is silence," Grace countered. "And I think that's what's been killing this town longer than any man with a gun." Evan studied her for a moment. There was something about her, sharp but not reckless, the kind of courage that comes from being wounded and learning to stand anyway. "All right," he said finally. "But you follow my lead." Grace smiled faintly. "Deal." Shadow let out a low rumble, not of anger, but alertness. His nose twitched, ears tilting toward the window. Evan followed his gaze and saw the shape of a pickup truck slowing near the tree line. He moved quietly to the window. The truck paused for a moment, engine idling, before rolling on down the hill. The rain swallowed its taillights. "They're watching," Irene murmured. "They want us scared." "Well," Grace said, lifting her camera with a defiant glint, "maybe it's time they learn fear isn't a one-way street." Later that afternoon, when the rain eased to a mist, Evan drove Grace and Clara into town. The streets of Silver Ridge glistened like wet slate, shop signs flickering under dim light. People watched the patrol car pass with that small-town mixture of curiosity and avoidance, the silent gossip that always came after something bad. At the clinic, Dr. Harold Benton, a wiry man in his 50s with kind eyes and a face permanently dusted with sawdust from his wood hobby, met them at the door. He wasn't a veterinarian by trade, but he treated farm animals often enough to qualify. "Officer Mercer," he greeted, adjusting his glasses. "Heard about last night. Brought me a patient?" "Yeah," Evan said, motioning to the back seat. "German Shepherd, male, 5 years old. Took a beating." Benton peered at the dog, nodding. "Beautiful creature. They're all heart, these shepherds. You patch them once, and they'd walk through fire for you." Clara hovered close while the doctor worked, her fingers twitching nervously as she watched the bandages replaced and the wounds cleaned. Shadow whined once, then rested his head in her lap. The doctor smiled gently. "He'll live. Maybe even chase a ball again before the week's out." Grace took a few photos. None of the faces, only the bandaged paw resting in Clara's hand. "Sometimes," she murmured, "one picture can shout louder than 1,000 sermons." Evan arched a brow. "You planning to publish that?" "Not yet," she said. "But someday, people will need to see what fighting back looks like." That night, the three of them returned to the Hensley home. The air was clearer now, the rain giving way to the faint shimmer of stars above the ridge. Evan helped Irene light the fireplace again, the orange glow washing away the chill. Clara sat curled beside Shadow, head resting on his shoulder, the rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing lulling her into sleep. Evan stood by the window, watching the road. Grace joined him, arms folded. "You really think they'll come back?" she asked. "They always do," he said. "Men like Doran don't stop until someone stops them." Grace nodded. "Then maybe that someone's finally here." Evan turned to look at her, half a smile ghosting across his face. "You volunteering?" She shrugged lightly. "Someone has to write history, Officer Mercer. Might as well be the ones living it." Outside, a lone owl called through the night, and the valley answered in silence. Evan glanced at Clara sleeping by the fire, at Shadow keeping watch even in rest, and felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of purpose, not duty, something deeper. He looked back to the window. The reflection in the glass showed 3 figures, him, Grace, and the faint outline of the child and the dog behind them, bathed in flickering light. For the first time since coming to Silver Ridge, Evan understood what he was fighting for, and he knew he wasn't alone anymore. The morning mist clung low to the valley, weaving through the forest like pale smoke. Silver Ridge was quiet again, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that follows a warning rather than peace. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the ground slick and silver under the early light. From the ridge, the Hensley farmhouse looked small, fragile, and alone, surrounded by miles of pine and damp earth. Evan Mercer stood beside his cruiser at the edge of the property, sipping lukewarm coffee and scanning the tree line. His uniform was wrinkled from a sleepless night, his eyes rimmed with red, but his mind was sharp. He'd stationed himself there through the night, just in case Doran's men decided to return. They hadn't, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Inside, Clara was sitting cross-legged on the rug, drawing with colored pencils Grace had bought her from the general store. The picture was simple: 3 stick figures, 1 dog, and a little house under a rainbow. But when Grace crouched beside her and looked closer, she noticed that the rainbow arched over the house while black shapes, trucks, crude and sharp, lined the horizon. "Is that the bad men?" Grace asked softly. Clara nodded, her pencil hovering midair. "They're waiting." Grace's throat tightened. She ruffled the girl's hair gently. "They won't get past us, kiddo." She stood and joined Evan by the doorway. Grace Whitmore had been awake almost as long as he had, though she hid her exhaustion better. Her auburn hair was tied in a messy knot at the back of her neck, her coat half buttoned, the camera strap slung diagonally across her chest. She'd spent the night typing notes and sending encrypted messages to a contact in Portland, a former journalist turned whistleblower who specialized in corporate corruption. "You look like you fought the night and lost," she said, holding out a thermos. Evan smirked faintly. "This town never sleeps when it's guilty." He took the thermos. "Thanks." Grace leaned against the doorframe, her gaze sweeping the fog-choked woods. "You really think Doran's behind it all? Arson, intimidation, even murder?" Evan's jaw tightened. "I don't think, Grace. I know." Before Grace could reply, Shadow padded into the doorway, head low but ears alert. The German shepherd's fur had begun to dry and fluff out again, revealing his true build, muscular yet graceful, a storm-gray coat streaked with faint silver along the back. His wounds were healing faster than expected, thanks to Benton's careful hands. When he lifted his head, his amber eyes reflected the faint light like twin coals. "He keeps sniffing at the window," Clara said from behind them, "like he hears something we don't." Evan crouched, scratching the dog gently behind the ear. "Maybe he does. Dogs like Shadow. They don't forget danger." That was when the knock came, 3 short raps against the front door. Evan's hand went to his sidearm instinctively. Grace froze, camera forgotten. The knock came again, louder this time. He opened the door just enough to see a man standing on the porch, hands raised in cautious greeting. The stranger was tall and narrow-shouldered, wearing a brown canvas jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. His boots were coated in mud. "Easy there," the man said, voice gravelly but calm. "Name's Roy Keller. I work maintenance up at Doran's construction site. I need to talk to you, alone." Evan studied him closely. The man looked to be in his early 40s, skin weathered and tanned, with the kind of face that had seen too many winters and too many bad choices. His eyes, though, a tired Hazel, held fear more than deceit. "Come in," Evan said cautiously. Roy stepped inside, glancing around the room like a man expecting ghosts. "I don't have long," he said. "If they knew I was here, well, I wouldn't be. You get me?" "Who's they?" Grace asked. Roy's fingers twitched. "Doran's foreman, men like Ray Larkin and Duke Maddox. He pays them to do what the sheriff can't be caught doing. I've been fixing machines up there, earth movers, trucks, but lately they've been using equipment for something else." "Something else?" Evan pressed. Roy nodded, pulling a folded photograph from his jacket. It showed an aerial view of a construction site deep in the forest. Fresh clearings, heavy machinery, and what looked like blackened earth near the creek. "That ain't development," Roy said. "That's covering evidence. You ever hear of a landslide 3 years ago near the old quarry?" "Yeah," Evan said slowly. "Killed a couple workers." Roy's jaw clenched. "Those weren't accidents either. Same company, same men. I overheard Doran himself last week saying, 'Make the Hensley problem go away before winter hits.' That's when I knew I couldn't stay quiet." Grace exchanged a look with Evan. "Why come to us? Why now?" Roy exhaled shakily. "Because I've got a daughter Clara's age. I can't look at her knowing I let another kid lose her family." Evan nodded. "You did the right thing, but if what you're saying is true, you're in danger." Roy laughed bitterly. "Already am. One of Doran's men followed me out of camp this morning. He drives a black truck with a cracked windshield. Looks like someone rammed it last night. That was you, wasn't it?" Evan's silence was answer enough. Roy's gaze darkened. "You got their attention now? They won't stop." Before they could question him further, the low growl of an engine echoed from outside. Shadow's ears perked, a deep rumble building in his chest. Evan peeked through the curtain and saw it. Another truck idling near the edge of the drive, 2 silhouettes inside. "Grace, take Clara to the back room. Now." Grace grabbed Clara's hand, ushering her quickly away. Irene watched from her chair, pale but silent. Evan drew his weapon and motioned Roy to stay low. Moments later, the truck rolled past slowly, its windows tinted. Then, just as suddenly, it turned and disappeared down the road. Roy exhaled shakily. "They're warning you. They do that before the fire." Evan holstered his weapon, but didn't relax. "Then we warn back." He walked to the porch and pinned the man's photograph to the wooden post with his pocket knife. "If they want to burn something," he said, voice low, "they'll have to look me in the eye first." By noon, Roy had left under Evan's protection to meet Grace's contact in town. Grace followed in her sedan, promising to return by evening with more proof. That left Evan at the farmhouse with Clara, Irene, and Shadow. As the afternoon deepened, he walked the perimeter of the property, studying the ground. It was then he noticed something strange. Sets of footprints leading through the wet soil near the back fence, fresh, light, and barefoot. "Clara," he called softly. The little girl appeared on the porch, clutching her drawing pad. "Yes? Have you been out back today?" She shook her head. "No, sir." He crouched to examine the prints again. They were small, like a child's, but wrong. The toes pointed inward, almost pigeon-like, and they vanished abruptly near the tree line. Shadow stepped beside him, nose twitching, ears alert. The dog gave a low growl and took a few steps forward before stopping, as though sensing something Evan could not. "What is it, boy?" Evan whispered. The forest whispered back, branches creaking, something distant shifting through the pines. Then silence. He stood, scanning the trees one last time. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Either way, Silver Ridge had secrets buried deep, and it was clear someone, or something, didn't want them uncovered. When Grace returned that evening, her face was pale but determined. She dropped a folder onto the table. "We've got proof," she said. "Financial records, shell companies, land transfers, all pointing to Doran's firm. He's been buying up land under fake names for years." Irene's eyes narrowed. "So he kills for signatures." Grace nodded grimly. "And bribes the law to look away." Evan stared at the folder, then at the faces around him, the brave girl, the wounded grandmother, the journalist who refused to run, and the dog who had already bled for them. He exhaled slowly. "Then we don't look away either." Shadow let out a quiet bark, as if agreeing. Outside, The pines swayed in the wind, whispering secrets only the brave dared to hear. The first frost came early that year. By morning, the ground around Silver Ridge had turned white. The forest hushed beneath a quilt of silence. Every breath left behind a faint ghost of mist, and every sound carried farther than it should have. Evan Mercer stood by the fence line of the Hensley property, watching his own breath swirl into the cold air. The snow was new, thin enough to reveal the shape of the earth beneath, yet thick enough to preserve the tracks of anything that dared cross it. He crouched near the spot he'd marked the day before. The strange footprints were still there, small, bare, and inward turned, but now more joined them. There were fresh prints beside them, booted ones, heavy and deliberate. Whoever had been here last night wasn't alone anymore. Evan's instincts prickled, the same sensation that used to come moments before an ambush overseas. He knew what silence meant. It was not peace, it was waiting. Behind him, the front door creaked open. Grace stepped out, bundled in a gray wool coat that contrasted against the snow. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her auburn hair tucked beneath a knitted beanie. She held 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling from the rims. "You've been out here since dawn," she said, offering one to him. "You'll freeze before the enemy does." Evan accepted it, nodding toward the tracks. Someone was here again, and they're getting closer to the house. Grace knelt beside him, squinting at the ground. "Could be hunters." He shook his head. "No. Look at the stride. This isn't random. Someone's casing the property." From the porch, Clara called out, her small figure wrapped in a blanket too large for her. "Officer Mercer, Shadow's barking at the woods again." The dog appeared moments later, bounding down the steps with surprising strength. His wounds had healed enough that he moved with the grace of his breed again, his coat thick and gleaming under the pale light. But his ears were rigid, his hackles raised, his body angled toward the tree line. He emitted a low, guttural growl, the kind that carried warning rather than fear. Evan followed his gaze and saw nothing but pines. Yet the unease didn't fade. "Inside," he said firmly. "All of you." They gathered around the fire while he secured the doors. Irene Hensley sat in her chair near the hearth, knitting with trembling hands. Her silver hair glowed in the firelight, her eyes darting between the windows. "I can feel it," she murmured. "The same stillness before the fire that took our old barn. Evil's patient, Officer Mercer. It doesn't rush. It waits until you're warm enough to forget it exists." Grace looked up from her laptop, which she had propped on the dining table. "Speaking of evil," she said grimly, "I've been digging through those files Roy gave us. He was right. Doran's development company has been laundering money through a chain of dummy corporations. They've been buying out land cheap, then torching what's left to collect insurance." "Any of that tied to the Hensley case?" Evan asked. Grace nodded. "The parcel registered under this property's lot number was transferred 2 days before Clara's parents died. On paper, it already belongs to a shell company called Winter Creek Holdings, owned by one of Doran's associates." Evan's eyes darkened. "So, the murders were just paperwork to them." "Exactly," she said. "And if Doran thinks you're sniffing around, he'll come to finish the cleanup." Before Evan could respond, the rumble of a vehicle echoed faintly from outside. He moved to the window. A black SUV rolled up the path, stopping short of the house. Snow fanned around its tires. A man stepped out, tall, dressed in a navy overcoat and leather gloves. His hair was silver gray, slicked back, his posture precise, almost military. Evan recognized him immediately. Sheriff Malcolm Cole. Cole was in his early 60s but still carried himself like a man who expected people to stand when he entered. He was clean-shaven, his face lined not by age but by authority long abused. His eyes were pale blue, cold, and assessing. He walked to the porch like he owned it. Evan opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Sheriff?" "Morning, Mercer." Cole's voice was smooth, polished. "Heard you've been playing house out here. Thought I'd come see for myself." Grace closed her laptop with a snap. "You're a little far from your jurisdiction, aren't you, Sheriff?" Cole smiled thinly. "My jurisdiction is anywhere trouble tries to grow roots, especially when my deputies report one of my officers has gone rogue." "I'm not your officer," Evan said. "You made that clear when you handed Doran the keys to this town." Cole's smile faltered. "Careful how you talk, Mercer. That temper of yours nearly cost you your badge once before." His gaze shifted past Evan to Clara, peeking from behind the curtain. "And now you're harboring fugitives? Dangerous habit." "She's a child," Grace said sharply. Cole ignored her. "You're interfering in an ongoing development dispute, Mercer. I suggest you step back and let the county handle it." Evan folded his arms. "You mean, let Doran handle it?" For a long moment, neither man spoke. The air between them was knife-thin. Then Cole's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be back tomorrow with an eviction order. I'd advise you to be gone by then." He turned and walked back to his SUV, snow crunching beneath polished boots. As he drove off, Shadow barked once, deep and sharp, chasing the vehicle's sound until it vanished into the woods. Grace exhaled. "Well, that's subtle." Evan looked down at her laptop. "We need to get that data somewhere safe." "Already?" "Done," she said. "I backed it to an encrypted drive and sent a copy to my contact in Portland. If anything happens to us, Doran's name hits the headlines by morning." That night, the storm rolled in again, thick and relentless. Wind howled through the pines, shaking the shutters. Evan patrolled the perimeter twice before midnight, Shadow padding silently beside him. Each time, he returned with snow in his hair and the same tightness in his chest, a feeling that something was drawing closer. Inside, Clara had fallen asleep beside the fire, her hand resting on Shadow's back. Grace sat at the table, typing under the dim glow of a lantern. "I keep thinking," she murmured, "why this land? Why the Hensleys?" Evan poured himself coffee gone cold. "Maybe because they wouldn't bow. Or maybe," she said, "because there's something buried here Doran doesn't want found." Before he could answer, Shadow's head jerked up, ears pricked. He stood, growling low. Then came the faintest sound, metal scraping against metal, somewhere near the barn. Evan grabbed his coat and flashlight. "Stay here," he ordered. Grace rose. "Not a chance." They crossed the snow together, wind biting at their faces. The barn loomed ahead, its doors ajar, hinges creaking in the storm. Evan lifted his flashlight and froze. Inside, the floor was littered with half-burned papers, old land surveys, and photographs singed at the edges. In the center, someone had drawn a crude cross on the dirt floor, marked with fresh ash. At its center lay a small wooden box, carved with the initials E.H. Evan knelt, brushing away snow. "Emily Hensley," he whispered, Clara's mother. Grace crouched beside him. "You think she left this?" "Maybe, or maybe someone wanted us to find it." From outside came the sharp echo of a gunshot. The bullet struck the doorframe inches from Evan's shoulder. He tackled Grace to the ground, flashlight clattering away. Shadow lunged forward, barking ferociously, teeth bared into the darkness beyond. Another shot rang out. Then silence. When Evan rose again, the assailant was gone, no sound but the wind. Only a single set of boot prints led away from the barn, vanishing into the black trees. Grace's hands trembled as she picked up the fallen box. "Whatever's in here," she said, voice shaking, "was worth killing for." Evan met her eyes, snowflakes melting on his lashes. "Then we open it tomorrow, in daylight." As they walked back to the house, Shadow followed close, glancing over his shoulder once, just once, toward the tree line, where something unseen still watched them breathe. The dawn that followed was thin and cold, the kind of light that revealed every scar of the world without warming it. The snow around the barn glittered faintly under a pale sky, broken only by the deep footprints Evan had left during the night. He hadn't slept. Neither had Grace. Both sat at the kitchen table now, the small wooden box resting between them, its carved initials, E.H., staring up like a secret that refused to stay buried. Irene Hensley watched from her chair by the window, a shawl wrapped tight around her frail shoulders. Her eyes, sharp even through age, followed the box as if it carried her daughter's breath. "Emily kept journals," she said quietly. But she was cautious. Said words could be twisted if the wrong eyes found them. Evan ran a hand along the lid. Then she wanted someone to find this. He opened the clasp. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a handful of photographs, a small brass key, and a folded map drawn in black ink. Grace leaned closer, brushing her hair aside. That's the ridgeline behind the old quarry, she murmured. And those markings, these look like coordinates. Evan studied the photos. They were grainy, black and white, printed from a surveillance camera. Men loading barrels into a truck marked with Doran's logo. One frame showed a second vehicle, a police cruiser parked nearby. Evan's stomach tightened. On the side door, faint but unmistakable, was the emblem of the Silver Ridge Sheriff's Office. Grace's expression darkened. Cole's been in on this from the beginning. Irene's voice trembled. My daughter knew. She told me once before the accident. She said the sheriff had dirty hands but clean speeches. I didn't want to believe her. Clara, who had been feeding Shadow scraps of bacon under the table, looked up suddenly. Mommy used to say secrets make people sick. Is that why they hurt her? Evan met Grace's gaze. Neither spoke. There was no answer a child deserved to hear. He folded the map carefully, pocketing it. If Emily found something buried out there, we need to see it before Doran does. Grace closed the box. Then we go now, before Cole makes good on his eviction threat. Irene gripped Evan's wrist. Be careful, Officer Mercer. The forest keeps what it's owed. He nodded once. I'll bring the truth back. By mid-morning, the snow had softened to slush. Evan and Grace followed the narrow service road leading into the hills north of Silver Ridge. Shadow trotted beside them, tail low but alert, his nose twitching constantly as if tracing invisible threads. The deeper they drove, the fewer signs of life remained. No mailboxes, no fences, only endless trees bowing under frost. After 40 minutes, they reached the clearing marked on the map. The air smelled faintly of iron and damp earth. Patches of disturbed snow led toward an old quarry pit, now half filled with murky, water frozen at the edges. A rusted sign read, Property of Doran Development in peeling red paint. Grace adjusted her camera strap. We're trespassing on the Devil's Lawn. Evan scanned the area. Then let's not stay long. They followed a narrow path down toward the base of the quarry. Near a cluster of birch trees, Shadow began to dig frantically at the snow, paws throwing white powder into the air. Beneath, they found a sheet of tarpaulin covering what looked like old wooden crates. Evan pried one open. Inside were rows of rusted barrels, stenciled with faded symbols. The letters HMX were still visible. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. High explosives, military grade. What the hell was Doran doing with this? Evan's pulse quickened. Smuggling, probably through government contracts. If Emily found this, she must have tried to expose him. He took a photograph with Grace's camera, but as the flash went off, a noise echoed from the ridge above, a car door slamming. Then voices. Someone's coming, Grace hissed. They ducked behind the crates. Through the brush, Evan saw two men approaching, one tall and gaunt, the other broad-shouldered and wearing a black beanie. The tall one carried a shotgun slung lazily over his shoulder. The other dragged a gasoline can. Boss wants this gone by nightfall, the tall man said. His accent was local, the kind that rolled slow but hit hard. Says Cole's handling the paperwork by morning. The other man snorted. Figures. Burn it all and pretend it never happened. Grace whispered. They're torching the evidence. Evan's mind raced. We can't let that happen. He gestured for her to circle left while he crept right. Shadow moved low beside him, each step silent. When the men reached the crates, Evan stood and leveled his gun. Police! Drop the weapon! The tall man swung the shotgun toward him, but Shadow leapt first, his body a blur of gray and fury. The man fell backward, shouting as the dog pinned him to the ground. The other dropped the gas can and bolted for the truck. Grace stepped out from behind a birch and snapped a photo, the shutter click loud as thunder. Stop! She yelled. But the man jumped into the truck, engine roaring. The tires spat snow as he tore down the road, vanishing into the woods. Evan cuffed the one left behind and yanked him upright. He was younger than expected, mid-20s, blonde stubble, shaking from adrenaline. What's your name? Evan demanded. The man spat blood into the snow. Duke Maddox. Grace's eyes widened. That's one of Doran's enforcers. Evan's grip tightened. Who ordered the attack on the Hensleys? Duke laughed weakly. You think it matters? You're already dead, cop. Doran owns the law. Cole's his shadow. They'll bury you before sundown. Evan's jaw clenched. We'll see about that. He hauled the man into the back of his SUV and radioed in, but static filled the channel. Someone was jamming the signal. Grace loaded the evidence box and camera gear. As they started back down the mountain, Shadow whined softly, ears twitching toward the trees. "What is it, boy?" Evan asked. The dog gave a low growl, staring into the woods. A faint reflection caught Grace's eye, a scope glinting on a distant ridge. "Evan!" she shouted. He slammed the brakes. A bullet shattered the passenger side mirror, spraying glass across the dashboard. Another pinged off the rear fender. "Get down!" he barked, shoving Grace toward the floorboard. Shadow barked fiercely, pressing against her legs. The next shot hit the rear window, cracking it like ice. Evan accelerated, tires fishtailing on the slick road, the truck jolting through turns until the gunfire faded behind them. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the sun was sinking behind the ridge. The snow glowed faintly pink, peaceful in a way that mocked what they'd just escaped. Evan pulled into a deserted rest stop, his hands trembling slightly on the wheel. Grace looked over, face pale. They knew we'd be there. Someone tipped them off. "Cole," Evan said flatly. "Had to be. He's running interference for Doran." Grace nodded slowly, clutching the camera. "Then we go public. Tonight. We take this to the Chronicle and every outlet in the state." "Not yet," Evan said. "We need the full story. What's in those barrels ties Doran to federal crimes. If we publish now, he'll bury us in lawsuits before the truth sticks." Grace sighed, then leaned back, exhaustion catching up. "So what now?" Evan looked toward the dark horizon. "We finish what Emily started. We bring them down." When they returned to the farmhouse, the air felt heavier. Irene met them at the door, worry etched into every line of her face. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked. Evan nodded. "And someone tried to stop us." She turned to the window, her reflection wavering in the glass. "Then it's beginning again." Clara ran up to them, clutching Shadow's collar. "I made him a medal," she said proudly, showing a cutout star made of tin foil. "Because he's brave." Shadow wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. For a brief moment, the darkness outside didn't seem so close. But when Evan stepped back onto the porch, he noticed something nailed to the fence, a single sheet of paper flapping in the wind. He tore it free and read the words scrawled in black ink. "Walk away, Mercer, or we finish what the fire didn't." His grip tightened until the paper tore in half. "Looks like they just declared war." Night wrapped itself around Silver Ridge like a dark tide, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The Hensley farmhouse stood quiet, its windows flickering with the soft glow of lamplight. Inside, Evan Mercer sat at the kitchen table, the torn threat note beside his coffee mug. His badge lay next to it, cold, gleaming, and almost mocking. Across from him, Grace Whitmore scrolled through photographs on her laptop, her fingers moving fast, her brow furrowed with determination. Shadow slept near the door, his body curled tightly, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. Every so often, his ears twitched, as if the night whispered things only he could hear. Clara had long fallen asleep in Irene's room, clutching the tinfoil medal she had made for Shadow earlier. For a moment, Evan let himself feel the peace of that, before it dissolved into the steady hum of worry that had become his heartbeat. "They know where we are," Grace said, breaking the silence. "That message wasn't just a threat. It was proof they're watching us. Probably have someone in town feeding them everything we do." Evan rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Cole's got eyes in every corner. If we move too loud, we'll lose the element of surprise." Grace's jaw tightened. "Then we move quietly. I've got someone who can help." Evan looked up. "Who?" "Her name's Sarah Boone," Grace said. "Used to work for the county records office. Got fired for leaking documents about Doran's zoning deals. She's been off the grid since, lives out by the river in a trailer. If anyone knows where Doran's hiding the money trail, it's her." "Can we trust her?" Grace gave a small, grim smile. "Sarah's the kind of person who trusts paper more than people, but she hates corruption more than cold coffee. I'll take those odds." They decided to go before dawn. Evan stood, holstered his sidearm, and glanced at Shadow. "You're coming too, partner." The dog's head lifted instantly, amber eyes sharp and ready. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the sky was streaked with pale silver. Frost glazed the road, and mist curled up from the riverbanks. Grace guided them down a narrow dirt path flanked by dead willows. At the end stood a trailer surrounded by clutter, old typewriters, boxes of newspaper clippings, and a wind chime made of shattered CDs that glittered faintly in the wind. Sarah Boone appeared in the doorway before they even knocked. She was in her late 40s, tall but thin, her figure slightly stooped, as though the world had pressed down on her shoulders for too long. Her hair was a dull chestnut streaked with white, chopped unevenly at her collarbone. Her face bore deep lines, some from age, more from disappointment. She wore a wool cardigan full of cigarette burns, and a pair of wire-frame glasses that constantly slipped down her nose. "I knew the day you'd show up," she said, voice rasped by smoke. "Journalists and cops are like rainstorms, unwelcome and impossible to ignore." Grace smiled faintly. "Good morning to you too, Sarah." The woman squinted past Grace, eyeing Evan. "And you brought a badge, brave or stupid, not sure which." "Depends on the day," Evan said dryly. She motioned for them to come in. Inside, the trailer was an organized chaos of papers, maps, and old monitors. The air smelled faintly of ink and instant coffee. Sarah sat at a desk piled with files, tapping ash into a chipped mug. "I kept copies," she said without preamble. Everything Doran wanted erased, permits, inspection forms, payment ledgers, all leading back to his front company. But the best part's what he hid under the ledgers. She pulled a folder free and spread several sheets across the table. Each bore stamps from state contracts, linked to supply chains for construction explosives. Doran's been selling unused federal explosive stock to private buyers, arms brokers, maybe worse. The Hensley land sits right on an old transport tunnel from World War II. That's where the shipments vanish. Grace's eyes widened. "That's what Emily must have found." Sarah nodded. "She came to me once, months before she died, said she had proof, but she was being followed. I told her to get out. She said she couldn't. Said there was a little girl who deserved to grow up in a clean town." Evan's throat tightened. "She died protecting that truth." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You remind me of her. Both stubborn. Both thinking the law still works if you shout loud enough." She tapped the papers. "But shouting doesn't scare men like Doran, making them bleed where it hurts, their money, their power. That's what brings them down." Before Evan could answer, Shadow suddenly rose from where he'd been lying. His fur bristled, eyes fixed on the window. A second later, headlights flashed through the fog, 2 vehicles pulling up fast. "Company?" Evan muttered. Sarah moved to a small cabinet and retrieved a revolver. "You didn't lead them here, did you?" "Not intentionally," Grace said. "Intentions don't matter," Sarah snapped, loading the gun with practiced precision. "Out the back, go." Evan checked his sidearm and pushed Grace toward the back exit. But before they could reach it, the front door burst open, and 3 men in tactical gear stormed in. Their faces were hidden behind black ski masks. One raised a rifle and barked, "Hands where I can see them!" Evan reacted first. He grabbed Grace and dove behind the table as bullets tore through the room. Papers exploded into the air like white confetti. Shadow lunged forward, snarling, teeth sinking into the arm of the nearest gunman. The man screamed, flinging his weapon as the dog dragged him down. Sarah fired twice, one shot striking the light fixture, plunging half the room into flickering shadow. Evan rolled toward cover, returning fire. The second man went down with a shout. The third grabbed Grace, pressing a knife to her throat. "Drop it, cop!" he yelled. Evan froze, breathing hard. Grace's voice trembled but stayed calm. "He won't kill me. He needs leverage." Sarah's revolver clicked empty. "Then what are you waiting for, Mercer? Do what you do best." Evan's eyes flicked toward Shadow, who had backed up, growling low. Then, with a single hand motion, he gave the command, "Now." Shadow lunged again, hitting the man's legs like a thunderbolt. The knife skittered across the floor as Evan tackled him, disarming him with a single punch. Grace stumbled free, gasping for breath. The air reeked of gunpowder and fear. 2 of the attackers lay unconscious. The third crawled toward the door, clutching his shoulder. Evan grabbed him by the collar. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood. "You already know?" Evan slammed him against the wall. "Say it." The man coughed. "Doran and the sheriff. They want the files. Said to make it look like a break-in gone wrong." Grace looked around the shattered trailer, the papers scattered like feathers. "Looks like they'll get their wish if we don't move." Sarah exhaled shakily, lowering her revolver. "Take the files. I'll hold them off if they come back." Evan shook his head. "You come with us. They'll kill you if you stay." Sarah gave a bitter laugh. "Honey, I stopped fearing death when I started reading tax records. Go, I'll be fine." Grace hesitated, then squeezed the woman's hand. "We'll finish it. For Emily, for Clara, for you." Minutes later, Evan and Grace sped down the road, headlights cutting through the mist. Shadow sat upright in the back seat, ears twitching, eyes still burning with adrenaline. The folder Sarah had given them lay on Grace's lap, the edges spotted with blood and ash. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Grace whispered, "She's going to die for this, isn't she?" Evan's hands tightened on the wheel. "Not if we end it first." As the fog swallowed the trailer behind them, a single gunshot echoed through the valley. Grace flinched but didn't look back. Shadow whined softly, resting his head on her shoulder. When they reached the edge of town, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, pale and tired. Evan looked at it and muttered under his breath, "One step closer, Emily. One step closer." The fog still clung to the valley like a ghost refusing to leave, and dawn rose gray and indifferent over Silver Ridge. Evan Mercer's truck cut through the mist along the winding road by the river, its headlights dim and wavering in the pale light. Grace sat beside him, the folder of Sarah's documents clutched tightly to her chest. Shadow, silent in the back seat, kept his head lifted, eyes fixed on the horizon as if anticipating danger before anyone else could see it. None of them spoke for the first hour of the drive. The silence was heavy, too heavy to fill with words. The echo of that gunshot near Sarah's trailer still lingered between them, like the last note of a song that wouldn't end. Grace finally broke the quiet. "You think she's gone?" Her voice was small but steady. Evan tightened his grip on the wheel. "I think she knew what she was doing. She made her choice." Grace's jaw trembled. Her choice shouldn't have been dying for the truth. Evan didn't answer. He couldn't. They drove through the forest, following the river that snaked between the hills. The air smelled of pine and gunmetal, the memory of smoke still drifting faintly from the south. Grace unfolded one of the maps from the folder, tracing a series of markings along the river's edge. "According to Sarah's notes, there's an access tunnel here," she said, pointing to a curve in the map. "It leads under the ridge toward the old munitions depot. That's probably how Doran's been moving the explosives." Evan glanced at her. "You're suggesting we go in there?" Grace smirked faintly. "You're the one with the badge. I just write about people like you." Before Evan could respond, Shadow let out a sudden growl, low and deep. His fur bristled, and his gaze locked on the rearview mirror. Evan looked back, and his blood ran cold. A black SUV was approaching fast from the bend, headlights off, tires grinding against gravel. "Hold on," Evan said. He pressed down on the gas. The truck roared forward, tires kicking up mud as they sped along the riverside road. The SUV followed, closing the distance with predatory precision. A bullet shattered the rear window, glass spraying through the cab. Grace ducked, covering her head. Shadow barked furiously, pressing close to her. "They're trying to run us off the road," Grace shouted. Evan swerved sharply, narrowly avoiding a tree as another shot pinged off the side mirror. He jerked the wheel, cutting toward a side path that led down to the riverbank. The truck bounced hard over roots and rocks, the suspension groaning. Behind them, the SUV followed relentlessly. "Evan!" Grace yelled. "We're boxed in." "Not yet." The road narrowed to a dirt trail leading straight to the frozen river. Evan hit the brakes and spun the truck sideways just as the SUV appeared behind them. The enemy vehicle skidded to a halt, blocking their retreat. Two men stepped out, both dressed in dark tactical gear, rifles in hand. Evan and Grace dove out opposite sides of the truck. Shadow leapt from the back seat, hitting the ground in a blur of gray and black. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the river cliffs. Evan returned fire, crouched behind the front tire, his breath steady despite the chaos. Grace crawled toward a fallen log, clutching Sarah's folder tight. "Shadow, stay!" Evan ordered, but the dog was already moving. He darted between bursts of gunfire, launching himself at one of the gunmen. The man went down hard, screaming as the German shepherd bit deep into his forearm. The other shooter swung his rifle toward the dog, but Evan's shot came first. The man dropped, his weapon spinning into the mud. Grace ran forward, eyes wide with adrenaline. "You okay?" Evan nodded, checking his ammo. "Yeah, for now." They searched the SUV quickly. The back seat was filled with fuel cans and a small case of C4 explosives, confirmation that this wasn't a random attack. Grace took photos while Evan radioed in again, only to hear static. "Signal's still jammed," he muttered. Grace sighed. "They're cutting us off from the outside world, one layer at a time." Evan wiped the mud from his sleeve. "Then we move before they regroup." They followed the riverbank until the trees thinned and the ruins of an old stone bridge appeared through the fog. Beneath it, half buried under frost and vines, was a steel door built into the rock. Grace knelt to inspect it. "This is it, the tunnel entrance." Sarah was right. Evan crouched beside her. The door was sealed with an old padlock, corroded but solid. He fired a single shot, and the lock shattered. The hinges creaked as he pulled the door open, revealing a dark passage sloping downward into the earth. The air that drifted out smelled of dust, rust, and something faintly chemical. Grace turned on her flashlight. "I can't believe this has been here all along." They moved cautiously through the tunnel, their footsteps echoing softly. The walls were lined with rusted rail tracks and broken carts, relics of another century. Farther in, the tunnel widened into a storage chamber. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked high and covered in cobwebs. The stenciled letters on their sides matched those from the quarry, HMX. Grace raised her camera, taking picture after picture. "This is enough to take Doran down for life." "Not yet," Evan said. "We need to prove the connection to him and to Cole." A faint sound echoed from deeper in the tunnel, a metallic clang, followed by footsteps. Evan motioned for silence. He crouched low, peering into the shadows. A figure emerged from the dark, carrying a flashlight. It wasn't a worker, it was Deputy Ray Larkin, one of Cole's men. Ray was in his late 30s, broad and square-jawed, his uniform stained with mud. His eyes were cold, calculating, the kind of man who followed orders without asking where they led. He froze when his light fell on them. "Mercer," he said slowly, "you shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," Evan replied, gun raised. "Drop the weapon." Ray smiled faintly. "You really think you can stop this? Doran's cleaning house, Mercer. Everyone who saw too much, Sarah, the Hensleys, you, that reporter, you're all ghosts already." Grace's hand trembled slightly, but she held the camera steady. "Then let's make sure your face is the last thing he sees before he falls." Ray lunged first. Evan fired, the bullet grazing his arm. The deputy crashed into him, knocking the gun away. They struggled in the dirt, grunting, fists landing hard. Grace grabbed a broken metal pipe and swung, striking Ray across the back. He roared, twisting to grab her wrist, but before he could, Shadow charged from the darkness, teeth sinking into his leg. Ray screamed, trying to shake the dog loose. Evan scrambled up, retrieved his weapon, and fired once. The deputy fell, gasping, his flashlight rolling into the shadows. For a moment, only their breathing filled the tunnel. Then Grace exhaled shakily. "Is he dead?" Evan checked the pulse. "No, but he's done fighting." He zip-tied Ray's hands, dragging him to the wall. "We'll turn him in when we can reach signal." Grace pointed her flashlight toward a sealed iron door at the back of the chamber. "Look, another room." Evan pushed it open, and his breath caught. Inside were hundreds of stacked crates labeled with government seals, alongside unmarked barrels of fuel. In the center stood a table with documents, ledgers, and an open laptop, proof of an active operation. Grace stared in disbelief. "He's been running all this from under our feet." Evan picked up a folder, flipping through contracts and shipping logs. "This ties Doran and Cole to illegal arms transport. Once this gets out, they're finished." Grace smiled faintly. "Then, we finally have what we need." Shadow whined softly, looking back toward the tunnel entrance. Evan frowned. He's sensing something. And then came the distant echo of engines, multiple vehicles, drawing closer. Grace's face paled. "They found us." Evan grabbed her hand. "We move. Now." They ran through the tunnel as the first explosions shook the ground behind them. The walls trembled, dust cascading from the ceiling. Shadow sprinted ahead, barking sharply, guiding them toward the faint light of the exit. The roar of collapsing rock filled the air as they burst out into the cold daylight and threw themselves behind a ridge. A plume of smoke rose from the tunnel mouth. The evidence, the crates, the files, all buried under tons of earth. Grace gasped for breath, tears of frustration cutting through the grime on her face. "It's all gone?" Evan shook his head. "Not all. You took photos. We still have enough." Grace nodded slowly, clutching the camera to her chest. "Then we fight smarter." Evan looked toward the rising smoke, his voice steady. "They think they buried the truth, but all they did was wake it." The wind picked up again that night, carrying the cold scent of burned earth from the river valley. Evan and Grace had driven for miles in silence, the forest blurring past like a memory that refused to settle. Behind them, the tunnel lay buried beneath tons of rock and smoke, taking with it the last tangible proof of Doran's crimes. But Grace still had her camera, and in its memory card, the truth lived, pixel by fragile pixel. By the time they reached the outskirts of Silver Ridge, the sun was setting behind the pines, staining the clouds crimson. The town looked deceptively calm, porches glowing with lamplight, chimneys smoking faintly, the quiet hum of evening life masking the rot underneath. They parked behind an old diner on Main Street, where the neon sign flickered weakly in the wind, Maggie's Place. Grace turned off the engine and leaned back in her seat, eyes closed. "We're ghosts now, you realize that?" she murmured. "Doran will have our names, Cole will have our faces, and the town will pretend not to see us." Evan stared out the windshield. "Then we stop pretending for them." Inside the diner, the smell of grease and coffee felt almost comforting. Maggie Harlan, the owner, looked up as the doorbell chimed. She was in her 50s, short and stout, her graying hair pinned in a loose bun. Her eyes were sharp, the kind of eyes that missed nothing. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Well, if it isn't Officer Mercer, you look like you've wrestled with hell and lost." "Maybe just tied," Evan said, managing a small smile. Maggie poured 2 coffees without asking. "What brings you in? Haven't seen you since the fire at the quarry." Grace glanced at Evan. "You can trust her?" He nodded. "Maggie's been feeding half this town since before I was old enough to drive. She's seen more lies than Cole's written." Maggie snorted. "That's not hard. Sit. You look like you're running on fumes." As they ate in silence, Maggie studied them closely. "You're not just hiding, are you?" she asked finally. Evan met her gaze. "We're trying to bring down Doran and Cole, and we're running out of time." Maggie exhaled slowly, her jaw tightening. "You're going to need help." Evan frowned. "From who?" "From the people who still remember what this town used to be," she said. "You think you're the only one who's seen his trucks moving at night? The only one who's lost someone to his fires?" Grace leaned forward. "You mean there are others?" Maggie nodded. "Farmers, truckers, miners, people too scared to speak alone. But if you can show them proof, they'll stand with you." Evan exchanged a glance with Grace. "Then we gather them." Before they could speak further, the door creaked open. A tall man stepped inside, his presence filling the small space. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark green coat dusted with snow. His face was weathered, framed by a beard gone mostly gray, but his eyes, steel blue, still carried the sharpness of someone who'd spent half his life in battle. Maggie's expression softened. "Evan, you remember Harlan Briggs, don't you? Used to run the ranger station before Doran shut it down." Evan stood, offering a hand. "I remember. You saved my unit's convoy during that wildfire 6 years ago." Briggs shook his hand firmly. "And you saved my nephew from a rock slide. Guess we're even." He sat down beside them. "Maggie told me what you're doing. I've got something you'll want to see." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small flash drive. "Security footage. I've been keeping cameras near the ridge since Doran started his development projects. This one's from 2 nights ago, his men loading crates into Cole's cruiser." Grace's eyes widened. "That's it? That's the link we needed?" Briggs nodded grimly. Then make it count, but be warned, Cole's been mobilizing the deputies. Word is, he's planning a raid on anyone suspected of helping you. I've got friends keeping watch, but it won't stay quiet for long. Evan exhaled. Then we'll move tonight. We take this evidence, the photos, and everything we've got to the State Bureau in Portland. Maggie frowned. That's a 4-hour drive through mountain passes, and there's a storm coming. You'll never make it without backup. We'll make it, Evan said. We don't have a choice. Grace loaded the footage onto her laptop, while Briggs handed Evan a shortwave radio. It's off-grid, can't be traced. I'll monitor your route. If anything happens, call Echo Blue. That's my line. They left the diner after dark, the storm clouds rolling in from the north. Snow began to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, dusting the road in white. Evan drove while Grace kept the laptop open on her knees, copying files onto multiple drives. Shadow sat upright between them, occasionally pressing his nose to the glass, watching the snow with restless alertness. Halfway up the mountain road, the storm hit full force. Wind howled through the trees, and snow swirled thick enough to blot out the stars. Evan slowed to a crawl, eyes straining through the white haze. Visibility's gone, he muttered. Grace looked at the map. There's a ranger outpost about a mile ahead. Maybe we can wait it out there. But before they reached it, headlights appeared behind them, bright and sharp. Then another set. Then 2 more. Evan's stomach sank. They found us. The lead car rammed their bumper hard, jolting them forward. Grace screamed as the laptop slid off her lap. Shadow barked furiously, claws scraping against the seat. Evan jerked the wheel, trying to stay on the icy road. Hold on! The truck spun sideways, tires skidding. Bullets shattered the rear window, whistling through the storm. Evan floored the gas, fishtailing through the snow until he saw a narrow turnoff leading into the forest. He took it, headlights bouncing through the trees. Branches scraped the windshield, snow blinding them in bursts. "They're gaining!" Grace shouted. Evan swerved sharply, plunging through a break in the tree line, and then the ground dropped. The truck hit an embankment, sliding down toward the frozen river below. They came to a shuddering stop halfway down. The vehicle tilted at an angle. Grace groaned. "You trying to kill us before they do?" "Move!" Evan barked. He grabbed the evidence drive from the dashboard and shoved it into her coat pocket. "If anything happens, you run north along the river. Don't stop." Grace stared at him. "Don't you dare!" But the roar of engines above cut her off. Flashlights swept across the ridge as men fanned out. Shadow growled low, pressing against Evan's leg. "They'll come down after us," Evan said. "We hold them here." Grace swallowed hard, pulling her camera from her bag. "Then we record everything. If this is where it ends, the world will know." The first figure appeared through the storm, a man in a deputy's uniform, rifle raised. Evan fired first, the muzzle flash lighting up the snow. The man went down. 2 more followed, shouting orders. Grace ducked behind the truck, snapping pictures between bursts of gunfire. Shadow darted into the open, tackling one of the attackers. The man fell back, yelling, before the dog's weight crushed him into the snow. Evan fired again, covering Grace as she crawled toward the fallen flashlight to capture their faces on camera. The storm howled louder, the wind blending with gunfire and echoing like thunder through the valley. Then, through the chaos, a new sound, a voice, amplified through a megaphone. "This is Sheriff Cole! Drop your weapon, Mercer! It's over!" Evan froze, staring up the ridge. The beam of a searchlight swept across the slope, blinding him. Cole's silhouette appeared against the snow, imposing, motionless, holding a pistol that gleamed under the stormlight. "Don't do this, Cole!" Evan shouted. "You've already lost. We have proof. It's over." Cole's voice was calm, too calm. "You think one drive and a few photos will change anything? The system was built for men like Doran, and men like me." Evan raised his weapon again, but before he could fire, another shot rang out. The bullet struck the hood beside him, sparks flying. Shadow barked, teeth bared, stepping between them. Cole's voice carried through the storm. "You should have stayed in line, Mercer." Evan's jaw tightened. "So should you." The standoff stretched for endless seconds until another engine roared in the distance. Then headlights appeared behind Cole, Harlan. Briggs's truck came barreling through the snow, its high beams cutting across the scene. Shots fired wildly as Briggs rammed one of the cruisers, sending it spinning off the ridge. "Move!" Evan yelled. He and Grace scrambled toward Briggs's truck, Shadow right beside them. Bullets tore through the snow as Briggs leaned out the window, shouting, "Get in! Now!" They dove inside, doors slamming just as another shot shattered the rear window. Briggs floored the accelerator, tires spinning before gripping the ice. The truck roared forward, tearing down the mountain road, leaving Cole's men fading behind into the blizzard. Grace looked back, panting. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Evan shook his head, glancing at the evidence drive still clutched in her hands. "Neither are we." Outside, the storm swallowed the world whole, but somewhere beyond it, the first pale streak of dawn was beginning to rise. The storm had finally broken. By dawn, the world was silent again, washed clean but wounded. Snow blanketed the mountains like a shroud, and the river below glimmered faintly under a cold, white sun. Evan Mercer's breath fogged the cracked windshield of Harlan Briggs's truck as they rattled down the mountain road toward Portland. Grace sat beside him, pale but steady, her hands gripping the flash drive that had already become their lifeline. Shadow lay in the back seat, his fur still damp, eyes half-lidded but alert. A quiet sentinel keeping watch while the world shifted toward reckoning. They drove in silence for hours, through winding roads and ghostly forests, until the first signs of the city appeared. Telephone poles, empty rest stops, and finally, the skyline rising faintly through the fog. It was strange to see life again after so many nights running from death. Harlan glanced in the rearview mirror, his face drawn but resolute. "Once we hit the bridge, we'll be close. My contact's waiting at the State Bureau. Ex-Army, name's Lieutenant Dana Coyle. Sharp as a blade, doesn't scare easy." Grace gave a weak smile. "Sounds like someone we could use." Dana Coyle was everything Harlan had promised. When they arrived at the Bureau, she stood waiting in the entryway. A woman in her early 40s with a compact frame, close-cropped blonde hair, and eyes the color of slate. Her presence radiated quiet authority. Even the officers at the checkpoint straightened when she spoke. She wore a dark field jacket instead of a uniform, her sleeves rolled up to reveal scars along her forearms. Souvenirs, perhaps, from a life spent chasing truth through chaos. "Mercer," she greeted, extending her hand. "You've stirred quite the hornet's nest." Evan shook her hand firmly. "Then let's burn the nest." They followed her into a briefing room lined with old file cabinets and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Grace connected her laptop to the screen, loading the footage Briggs had given them and the photos from her camera. One by one, the images flashed across the display: Doran's trucks loaded with explosives, the secret tunnel under the ridge, Cole's cruiser parked at the scene. The final clip showed Sheriff Cole himself, shaking hands with Doran in front of a burning field. Dana leaned back, whistling softly. "This is enough to start a war." Grace's voice was calm but brittle. "Then start one." Dana nodded. "I'll send this to the governor's task force immediately. But you should know, once this goes public, there's no going back. Doran and Cole won't vanish quietly." Evan's jaw set. "We're counting on that." Outside, the first news alerts began to break. By midday, the story had hit every major network in Oregon. Silver Ridge sheriff implicated in federal explosive scandal, construction magnate under investigation. Reporters flooded the bureau's steps. Helicopters buzzed over the city. Inside, Grace and Evan watched the coverage unfold on a muted television, the truth spreading faster than any fire Doran could ever start. But victory, as Evan knew too well, was never clean. It was dusk when the first explosion hit. The building shook violently, windows shattering inward. Screams echoed through the corridors as smoke filled the air. Dana grabbed her sidearm, barking orders. "They found us! Secure the evidence room!" Evan pulled Grace behind cover while Harlan ran toward the entrance. Shadow bolted ahead, barking furiously. Through the shattered glass, Evan saw black SUVs blocking the street. Doran's men again, desperate and reckless. Fire licked at the edges of the snow outside, turning the city orange. Gunfire erupted. Evan fired back from the stairwell, his heart pounding. Grace ducked low, clutching the drive. Dana moved with the precision of a soldier, taking down one attacker before rolling behind a pillar. "They're not here to kill. They're here to destroy the evidence," she shouted. But then, through the smoke, a familiar voice rang out. "Mercer." Evan froze. Sheriff Cole stepped into view, flanked by two armed men. His once perfect uniform was stained with mud and soot, his face twisted into something colder than hate, conviction. "You really thought you could tear down what men like me built?" Cole sneered. "You think truth wins? Truth burns, Mercer, just like everything else." Evan stepped forward, gun raised. "You killed innocent people. You destroyed families. Emily Hensley died because of you." Cole's smile faltered. "Collateral. There's always collateral." "You mean witnesses," Grace said, standing beside Evan. "But not anymore." Cole aimed his weapon at her, eyes narrowing. "You should have stayed behind your desk, Miss Whitmore." Before he could fire, a shot rang out from behind him. Cole staggered, clutching his shoulder. Harlan Briggs stood near the doorway, rifle steady. "I told you once, Cole," he growled. "You don't own this town anymore." Chaos broke loose. Dana and her agents surged forward, disarming Cole's men in a blur of motion. Evan tackled Cole, the two crashing to the floor. The sheriff fought like a man possessed, his fists fueled by pride and fear. "You think you're better than me, Mercer? You think you're clean?" Evan pinned him down, his breath ragged. "No, just better than what you became." Cole spat blood, laughing weakly. "You can't stop him. Doran's already gone. He'll rebuild." Evan's voice was low, deadly calm. "Not this time." Outside, sirens wailed. Federal vehicles flooded the street. Through the smoke, agents in tactical gear surrounded the compound. And there, dragged from one of the black SUVs, was Calvin Doran himself, hands bound, face pale, his tailored coat dusted with ash. Grace watched as reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "What do you have to say, Mr. Doran?" someone shouted. He didn't answer. He just stared past them, at Evan, at Grace, at Shadow. And in that moment, for the first time, there was something human in his eyes, fear. Hours later, when the fires were out and the building secured, Dana approached Evan on the steps outside. "They'll both stand trial," she said. "Federal charges, no deals. You did good, Mercer." Evan nodded, exhaustion heavy in his bones. Grace stood nearby, watching the sunrise bleed across the city. Shadow rested at her feet, muzzle resting on his paws, tail twitching lazily. "You know," Grace said softly, "Sarah would have loved to see this." Evan smiled faintly. She did, in her way. They drove back to Silver Ridge the next day. The town looked smaller now, quieter, humbled. Word had spread fast. Doran's empire was unraveling. Cole's name was scraped off the sheriff's door, and the townspeople were rebuilding what fear had stolen from them. At the Hensley farmhouse, Irene stood on the porch, tears glistening as Evan and Grace stepped out of the truck. Clara ran forward, arms wide, Shadow bounding after her with a joyful bark. The girls' laughter carried through the cold morning like sunlight finally breaking through a storm. Evan knelt, pulling Clara close. "Your mother was brave," he said. "Because of her, people will sleep safe again." Clara smiled up at him, eyes bright. "Mommy said the truth always comes home." Grace's voice trembled as she whispered, "And it did." As they stood there, Evan, Grace, Clara, and the loyal dog who had seen it all, the church bell from town began to ring in the distance, slow and steady. The sound drifted across the valley, through the thawing pines, over the place where the lies had burned away. The light finally returned to Silver Ridge. At the end of this story, we are reminded that even in the darkest storms, God's light never fades. When fear surrounds us, when injustice seems to win, He sends strength in the form of courage, love, and loyalty, sometimes through people, sometimes through a faithful heart like a dog's. Every act of kindness, every choice to stand for what is right, is a reflection of His hand guiding us toward redemption. In our own lives, we may not face burning houses or hidden crimes, but we all face battles that test our faith. And just like the officer, the child, and their loyal companion, we can choose to believe that miracles still happen, often quietly through compassion and grace. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And write amen if you believe that God still works wonders in the lives of those who keep faith. May the Lord bless you, protect your family, and fill your heart with peace and light. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and the quiet miracles that remind us we're never truly alone.